You know, friends, it's interesting how the Supreme Court bends over backwards and ignores the Constitution to help, to come to the aid of, to rescue Donald Trump. But they let his criminal flunkies twist in the wind and slouch off to prison, one after another. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So friends, this new Supreme Court opinion is a staggering piece of judicial abuse. Their pronouncement that essentially a president is a king, above the law, beyond the reach of our nation's criminal laws. You know, it's shocking in its transparent impropriety and in its favoritism toward Donald Trump. It was authored by who? Chief Justice John Roberts. Shocking, I know. Now, as promised, what I want to do in the coming days and today is take pieces of this lengthy Supreme Court opinion, 119 pages, and sort of boil them down to their essence and talk about what the Supreme Court has actually done to our criminal justice system, to our Constitution, and to our country, because they have thrown it all into chaos. But before we get to that, I want to look at some recent developments regarding some of Donald Trump's criminal associates, his flunkies, guys like Steve Bannon, in prison, Peter Navarro, in prison, and the king of all Donald Trump criminal flunkies, Rudy Giuliani. Because Rudy was just disbarred by a unanimous 5-judge panel of a New York appeals court. Let's start with the new reporting on that. Headline from NBC News: Rudy Giuliani is disbarred in New York for spreading Donald Trump's 2020 election lies. And that article begins, Rudy Giuliani, the disgraced former New York City mayor who tried to overturn former President Donald Trump's election loss, was disbarred in the state of New York on Tuesday, yet another repercussion for the team that spread lies about mass voter fraud after Joe Biden's 2020 presidential victory. Giuliani, who is facing criminal charges in Georgia and Arizona and is an unindicted co-conspirator in the federal election interference case brought against Trump by special counsel Jack Smith, had no good faith basis to believe the lies he spread about the election, according to an order entered Tuesday. Some of the false statements cited by a New York appeals court were comments Giuliani made during a post-election press conference at Four Seasons Total Landscaping, which took place at the same time that some news outlets called the election for Biden. Quote, these false statements were made to improperly bolster respondents, Giuliani's, narrative that due to widespread voter fraud, victory in the 2020 United States presidential election was stolen from his client, Donald Trump. The decision from a New York appeals court read, Giuliani has arguably faced much wider repercussions for his efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 election than Trump himself. He also faces disbarment in Washington, D.C., where the D.C. Bar's Board of Professional Responsibility recently recommended that Giuliani be disbarred. In May, Giuliani was suspended by WABC Radio and his show canceled for continuing to make false statements about the 2020 election, which could have potentially opened the station up to legal liability. Two Georgia poll workers, Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, were awarded $148 million by a jury after a federal judge found Giuliani liable for falsely accusing them of election fraud, allegations which had zero factual basis. Because of surveillance video that had spurred conspiracy theorists online, Giuliani had falsely accused the mother-daughter duo of passing around USB drives like vials of heroin or cocaine, when in fact they were passing a ginger mint. The allegations by Rudy Giuliani, the false allegations by Rudy Giuliani, set off a wave of racist attacks and threats against the pair. Yes, Rudy Giuliani's lies are responsible for racist attacks on two Georgia State poll workers. My editorial edition. In the course of the New York disciplinary case, Rudy Giuliani stipulated, in other words, he admitted to the reality that there were not, in fact, many thousands of votes cast in the names of dead people in Philadelphia during the 2020 election, as he'd previously falsely claimed. The disbarment ruling found 16 acts of falsehoods carried out by Giuliani were deliberate and constituted a transparent pattern of conduct intended and designed to deceive. And get this, friends, Giuliani even attempted to deceive the officials during the disciplinary process itself. So I find it interesting, friends, that the Supreme Court won't do anything to help Donald Trump's criminal associates, his flunkies, his lapdogs, like Steve Bannon, Peter Navarro, Rudy Giuliani, but they just can't quit Donald Trump. So now let's pivot to the Supreme Court ruling and take just one piece of it, boil it down to its essence, and see what the Supreme Court has done to us and to our Constitution and to our country. And we're going to start with what the Supreme Court calls core presidential powers. Core presidential powers enjoy, they tell us, absolute immunity, absolute presidential immunity. For example, let's use a concrete example as we talk through this portion of the Supreme Court opinion: pardons. They say pardons involve a core presidential power. So what does that mean? It means you can't touch it. It means you can't ask about it. It means you can't investigate it. It means you can't question it. So if Donald Trump set up a pardon kiosk in the lobby of the White House and sold pardons for $1 million a pop or $1 billion a pop because it's a core presidential power, the president gets to do it. And there's not a damn thing the Supreme Court tells us that law enforcement or prosecutors or courts can do about it. That is the opposite of what our country and our rule of law is all about. And the Supreme Court knows it. So now we're going to run through a hypothetical because we're going to talk about the blueprint that the Supreme Court just delivered to Donald Trump. Admittedly, delivered it to all presidents, and we're going to talk in the future about what, if anything, President Joe Biden should do with this new power of lawlessness that the Supreme Court has given him. But here's the hypothetical: core presidential powers. The pardon power, and the Supreme Court also tells us that another core presidential powers that cannot be questioned involves when a president consults with his attorney general and his high DOJ officials about crime fighting. That's going to be a talk for another day, because what Donald Trump did with his DOJ officials was not crime fighting, it was crime committing. Let's set that aside, because under the Supreme Court ruling, whether it's crime fighting or crime committing, if it's a core presidential power, you can't touch it, you can't question it, you can't investigate it, and you can't prosecute it. So we're going to put these two things together, these two core presidential powers, the pardon power and the power to consult with his Attorney General and his high DOJ officials. Here is what the Supreme Court just gave Donald Trump a blueprint to do. Are you ready? Donald Trump, in the horrific event he's reelected, he won't be. But if he did retake the reins of federal power, he could get his Attorney General into the Oval Office and say, I am now directing you, Mr. Attorney General. He will undoubtedly appoint somebody who is even more corrupt than his last Attorney General, Bill Barr, if that's possible. Maybe he'll just bring Bill Barr back to do his criminal bidding again. He will say, Mr. Attorney General, I am now directing you in your crime-fighting capacity to round up my political opponents, my perceived enemies, those who have spoken out against me in recent years, and put them in a detention camp. No charges, right? No criminal complaint, no evidence, no due process. No. In my crime-fighting capacity, I'm directing you to do it. Do it. It is a core presidential power. So the Supreme Court says what? You can't touch it. You can't ask about it. You can't question it. You can't investigate it. And you can't prosecute it. That is expressly what the Supreme Court said. Interestingly, even though the president can't be prosecuted for unlawfully confining his perceived enemies without charges or due process, the Attorney General, in theory, could be, because he doesn't have presidential immunity, because he doesn't exercise core presidential powers. But what does the president do to keep his Attorney General from being prosecuted? He pardons him. Another core presidential power that you can't question, you can't investigate, and you can't prosecute. There's the blueprint for totalitarianism. Period. This is exactly what the Supreme Court ruling says, sets up, contemplates. And it couldn't be more dangerous to not just the health of our democracy, but to the continued viability of our democracy. So in future videos, folks, I promise we're not only going to unpack and digest and talk about what other parts of the Supreme Court opinion mean, what they enable a criminal president to do with impunity, but we are going to talk about what we should do about it, what President Biden should do about it, what our executive branch and our legislative branch should do about it, because we will not go quietly. And I'm going to drop a preview right here. I was active duty Army for 6.5 years. I served proudly. The only reason I left the Army, I was an Army JAG officer prosecuting first court-martial cases and then handling cases for the government kind of as a prosecutor in the appeals court when soldiers would appeal their convictions at court-martial. And I got to handle appeals in death penalty and espionage cases, some really interesting and rewarding litigation. In the military, it is drilled into our heads that, of course, we have to obey lawful orders, but even more importantly, we must disobey unlawful orders. We are required to by our very oath. It is our duty to disobey unlawful orders. Put a pin in that one, friends. We're going to circle back to it. But as of right now, let's remain focused on, and I don't know if I'm going to end every video this way, but I might. I welcome your feedback. Please send me comments or go to my website, glennkirshner.com, and let me know what your thoughts are on this proposal. Ending every video with, Donald Trump may not go to trial in any other criminal case before the election, but he still has to be judged by one jury. And we, the people, are that one jury. We stand between Donald Trump and dictatorship, plain and simple. But we get to go to the polls. Just like a jury gets to vote based on the evidence they see, their responsibility is to vote guilty or not guilty. We get to go to the polls. We are the jurors, and we will vote on November 5th based on the evidence we see, either guilty or not guilty. And we will vote guilty. Donald Trump is guilty of trying to destroy our democracy. He's also guilty of, for example, revoking women's constitutional privacy rights. He believes that he and a bunch of old politicians get to decide women's reproductive health issues and decisions for each woman over their objection and without their consent, indeed without their participation. Donald Trump thinks he gets to decide that for the women of our country. Are you flippin' kidding me? He's guilty. And we will vote guilty on November 5th. Because justice matters. Friends, as always, please stay safe, please stay tuned, and I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow.